some commentators have argued that growing cultivated meat in bioreactors at any meaningful scale is just a food tech fantasy. Well, that all depends on the approach you take, says Josh March, co-founder at Sci-Fi Foods.
Yeah, ultimately, I founded Sci-Fi Foods because I wanted to make sure we had a commercially viable approach to getting to market. And one of the big things we did initially in the company was do a techno-economic analysis and really understand the capex, the unit economics, all the different technologies. And one of the clear things that came out of that was that if you take a blended approach and you can develop animal cell lines that have similar performance to the cell lines used in biopharma today, then you can make a blended product commercially viable at affordable price and relative scale using existing technology without needing crazy scale bioreactors, without using anything else. And so that's why that's the first products that we'll be doing kind of follow that pattern. I do think you need genetic engineering and synthetic biology to get to that point, but still it's very, very viable. I do agree, however, that when you look at technology today, it's not viable to do 100% cultivated meat. I think there are people working on the relevant bioreactor and manufacturing technologies that will make that possible. And over the next decade, I think that is the clear future. But I think it's important to differentiate and separate what's possible today and what's going to be possible tomorrow.
So as for what's possible today with your blended approach, what kind of ratios are we talking about with, a cell culture product versus presumably some kind of plant-based component, and how meaty is the end result?
So it depends on the format, right? But we're kind of playing with inclusion rates from anywhere from like 10 to 30% inclusion rates. Ultimately, we start to see a really big flavor impact, even at kind of 5 to 10% inclusion rate. And the more you add, the kind of bigger that impact becomes. The cells really start to kind of mask a lot of the planty off notes and bring in a lot of like beefy notes, right? And in some ways that maps to, if you look at the fat content of conventional ground beef, for example, it ranges from like 5 to 20%, and that's the biggest determinant of the flavor and experience. And I think we see similar with the impact of bringing in our cultivated cells. We are not using stem cells. Ultimately, stem cells are really challenging, right? Because stem cells, while they have some benefits, they're kind of naturally immortal, and maybe grow in suspension a little easier. Stem cells want to turn into all kinds of different cells, and so you have to control the conditions really, really carefully. But that's not really compatible with like a very large-scale biomanufacturing process where you really want very robust cell lines that you can stick in a really big bioreactor in a very simple process, and they just do one thing really, really well. Right? So ultimately, we see a lot of challenges with the stem cell approach. So we're taking satellite cells from a cow muscle, and we're using the power of synthetic biology to immortalize those cells, to get those cells growing in single cell suspension, and to make sure they have all the performance characteristics necessary so that we can scale them affordably. Well, we're not trying to create tissue, right? So we're not trying to create muscle tissue or fat tissue, but they are, muscle cells that we're creating a large amount of and using that as an ingredient.
Yes. Okay, so it takes a kind of village to get a new industry off the ground. What progress are you seeing in this broader ecosystem, whether it's bioreactor design or cell culture media, that gives you the confidence that costs are going to come down for this industry?
Yeah. So, like I said, at Sci-Fi Foods, a core part of our strategy was, can we create a commercially viable plan that doesn't require innovation from anyone else, right? Because while we hope and support lots of innovation, we don't want to rely on it. And so that's core to our kind of blended and SynBio strategy. However, there's a ton of really interesting innovation happening in like basal media and food-grade amino acids from a lot of really big players. Merck, Millipore-Sigma have some initiatives there. There's some major biomanufacturing conglomerates around the world who are working on food-grade amino acids for the industry that I think are going to be really, really helpful as we scale. And then there are startups working on novel bioreactor designs like ARC, who we have some really exciting plans that, if they're successful, have the potential to decrease the capex requirements for cultivated meat by like 90%, right? And it's those innovations, as well as other tissue maturation bioreactor innovations, that will make 100% cultivated meat possible over the next decade, which is obviously a really exciting proposition. In our analysis, when we look at the technologies that are possible today, we think the only technology that really makes sense is very simple stir tank, fed batch bioreactor processes that are very established, pretty cheap to deploy, pretty simple, and are known to scale, and you get real economies of scale. And so, the bigger you can get the bioreactors, the better it is from a capex perspective. So that's really the model that we're taking, and we think that has the least possible risk. As we look to the future, I think approaches like ARC have the potential to dramatically change the kind of capex and the equation essentially when it comes to cultivated meat. So I am excited by what they're doing, but I'm kind of skeptical of a lot of the other approaches that exist today.
So when and where do you hope to go to market first, and what's your kind of current manufacturing setup?
Yeah, so we're building our pilot plant at the moment actually in the Bay Area, which we're really excited about. That pilot plant will be ready this year. We're not expecting to have regulatory approval probably at least for another year after that. Our goal is to start with food service, right? So we're already speaking to restaurants and chefs to pick the first kind of dozen or so launch partners. And the plan will be to start with restaurants and food service, kind of gradually expand there before eventually getting into retail and mass market.
So I want to talk about sustainability, because a UC Davis study has just come out claiming that greenhouse gas emissions from cultivated meat could be 25% higher than regular beef. And I know there's some caveats around, some of the assumptions made in that analysis. But other LCAs paint a more favourable picture, but still say energy costs could be high. So how much do we really know at this stage?
The UC Davis one you mentioned makes some pretty big assumptions around requiring pharmaceutical grade amino acids, which the industry kind of pretty strongly disagrees with. I think we can just use food grade. But really I see it as just kind of beside the point. Ultimately, our goal is to be able to reduce deforestation, reduce methane emissions, and if we shift all of that to energy usage, which can be powered by electricity, then that can all be powered renewably at zero emission. And ultimately, I'm extremely excited by the innovations that are happening in renewable energy, and I think in 10 years, we're going to have a net neutral grid, electricity grid, right? And so if we can shift all of those emissions to electricity, then in 10 years we're going to be in a really, really good spot. Yeah, we've raised about $40 million, and we have some really amazing investors supporting us. So we feel very lucky to be in that position. There's no doubt that the general fundraising climate right now is very challenging for all startups. And for food tech as well, with the challenges that plant-based meat have been having and beyond are having, that can be a little, it depends on the investor. For a lot of investors, they're just like, just stay away from the whole sector. For other investors, they're like, look, it's clear that the big consumer trends are there. Like half of all US consumers under 40 consider themselves flexitarian right now. The fact that plant-based meat is struggling isn't because the big challenge, the problems remain. People want solutions. It's just the current solutions aren't good enough, and so they see cultivated meat as the potential answer to that. 3 or 4 years ago, the press coverage around cultivated meat was almost universally positive. Today we're seeing comparisons to Theranos and fear-mongering articles about cancerous cells. What has changed, and how should the industry respond? Yeah. Ultimately, I think we always see these kinds of ebbs and flows with any new industry. I mean, electric cars had years and years of horrific coverage about how they were never going to make it and how they were terrible, and now they're clearly beginning to dominate, right? So sometimes these new technologies do take a while to come to fruition, and journalists get excited when something new is there, and then when it doesn't immediately work, it's easy to start writing kind of negative articles. And so I think we're just seeing that kind of natural cycle. Ultimately, our perspective is that I think we have to build trust by being very transparent and open and honest and authentic about where we're at and what we're doing. And that's really been our approach in talking about the science. And then just stay focused and heads down and work to build a great product that can have a big impact on the world.
Your brand is Sci-Fi Foods.
Yeah.
Do consumers want to eat Sci-Fi Foods?
Well, I think there's this question of, do they want to eat lab-grown meat? And for me, those are kind of one and the same. We know that when we launch, the meat lobby is going to be coming after us really hard for being franken meat. A lot of the press still calls it lab-grown meat. The science is very heavily kind of featured. We don't think you can hide that, right? You can try and pretend it's all natural. You could call it nothing to see here foods. No one's going to believe it, especially in the kind of Gen Z social media world. It's just going to come across as inauthentic, right? So I don't think you can avoid the fact that it is sci-fi. It is kind of sci-fi, right? But at the same time, it's really cool, right? We're growing real meat without the animal. It's exciting, right? It's not the sci-fi, it's not the dystopian sci-fi, right? It is the kind of optimistic sci-fi that we used to dream about, right? How can we create this future where you can eat whatever you want, you don't need to worry about deforestation or burning the world down, and you can still enjoy a burger with friends. And so we think that's an exciting vision to get around, and allows us to be very authentic and kind of bold with what we're doing, and really differentiate ourselves from plant-based meat, which honestly I think has a bit of a branding issue.